after next week, I'm supposed to be attending the ICICT conference, and I'm actively participating in that conference. It's not just a conference, actually, it's a workshop. Workshop starts on a Sunday, which is the 24th. So I mean, certainly we're going to have class on Monday. I'll try and make sure. I'm not really sure about Tuesday because this event is taking place very far. It's Mika Convention Center or something. But maybe I can try and wing it, right? We can have class on Monday, which is the evening. I'll probably be back in Lusaka or something. And then on Tuesday, because it's early in the morning, we can have our class, and then I'll start off somewhere around 8. I think our sessions are planned to start at 9 or something. So we'll have class in, but I'm not really so sure about Wednesday, which is the 20th, in which case we'll probably have to shift the class to 27th, 25th, 26th, 27th, which class would have to shift. In which case we have to shift the class to the evenings or something. So trying to make sure we don't lose time here. But anyways, we're going to continue our discussion, ladies and gentlemen. You know, we've started looking at, I guess, a topic that most of you have probably been very much looking forward to, which is a discussion of the research methodology. Yes, there's a hand up.
Yes, my name is Helen. I recently logged in from the link, the same link that you've sent, that has been sent in the groups, but it's saying someone removed me from the group.
Yeah, just rejoin. It's you see when and I didn't realize that I hadn't shared my screen. You notice when I switch on the recording here, this thing, if you haven't accepted, I guess, consented to doing that, it checks you out once it starts recording. So just rejoin. Yeah, just rejoin. Thank you very much.
All right, sure.
Yeah, it's probably a couple of other people that were affected also. All right. So if you remember last time, right, we started our discussion of the research approach. In fact, what we did was we introduced this whole notion of the so-called research onion, apparently, and we realized that there are certain important, methodological aspects that we've got to take into account, right, when we're working on towards designing a study, if you will, coming up with a research design, okay, or an experimental design. And so we realize that we've got to take into account important things such as, if you remember the key elements here, the philosophy, right, the philosophical or underpinning or paradigm associated with your study. So you can either take what we introduced as a positivist approach, or you can leverage constructivism, for instance, which we also, introduced as interpretivism, right? And then there's pragmatism as well. These essentially are nothing more than ways of knowing the truth. And this makes sense because at some point we had a very interesting discussion early on during this course, right? Where we're discussing like different ways of knowing. We were joking about how traditionally, as Africans, we've relied on these people that hold on to memories, old people, something like that, right? Anyways, so we discussed this, and then at some point we started our discussion of a so-called research approach, right? Remember, we're looking at things like the research philosophy or the paradigm, the research approaches, the research strategies, the time horizon, and any other data collection methods that you may be using. So we're discussing these things here. Our entire discussion in this particular lecture series is going to be centered around these things. Almost done, actually, almost there. Maybe halfway through, not almost done. So we had a discussion of the so-called research approach, right? And we discovered that this is nothing more than just a comprehensive plan, if you will, right? A comprehensive plan and procedure for the study itself. Something else that we highlighted was the fact that this plan, I mean, it is a plan, so it spans the entire research process. And it will include like the broad philosophical assumptions that you're making, all the way up to the data collection and data analysis. In fact, this is the reason why your research methodology section or chapter will include a subsection or a section called data analysis. And all you're doing is you're outlining exactly how you plan to analyze the data. We are going to analyze the data using R or SPSS. We are going to do a thematic analysis and we'll use in vivo. You understand this? So there was mention of that. And then, I don't know why this is not working here, and then we then started our discussion of well, I mean, there was mention as well on how. By the way, this slight change here. What I did was I decided to pick some interesting information from one of your prescribed books by Creswell, Research Design. And what Creswell does is he does a really, what those people do is they do a really thorough job of trying to highlight the fact that ideally, right? Ideally, your world view is supposed to typically shape the research design that you choose to use, and the research design is going to determine the specific methods, right, that you're going to employ in terms of data collection and analysis and eventual interpretation of the data itself. So in other words, your philosophical worldview, the research designs, and the research methods are interconnected. Yeah. And so what Creswell says is that these three key elements will form the approach, the research approach itself. Yeah. And in fact, if you think about the examples I was giving you, these different studies that I told you to go and read as homework, but also the ones that we went through together in class, you notice that when we were touching on the methodology, in almost all the instances would talk about, not all of these, but at least the last two, is it? There was very less focus on things like, oh, we took is it a positivist approach or something like that, right? I guess it's assumed by just looking at the research designs employed, but certainly there was mention of the research design and the research methods themselves. Like we collected data using a questionnaire, or we interviewed experts from university teaching hospitals or something like that. Now, again, what we discovered was that in terms of research approach, it turns out that there are three main research approaches, right? We mentioned a quantitative research approach, qualitative research approach, and also a mixed methods approach. And all the while, we briefly gave an idea as to what these approaches are all about, right? And in fact, towards the very end, we actually highlighted or focused on a quantitative approach. So we gave examples of instances of scenarios when you might be interested in leveraging this approach. Typically, you'd leverage a quantitative research approach when you're testing hypotheses, for instance, or you're trying to establish facts. We want to figure out if this drug is going to be effective, or what sort of dosage is going to be effective, relationships and correlations, right? When you're looking at making predictions as well. And typically, something else that came up was that the data that you collect is numeric, right? Quantitative, you're going to be quantifying things. You're working with numbers, right? Numeric data. And so you tend to work a lot with so-called variables, right? Independent variables, dependent variables, control variables, right? All of those things that we discussed again early on in the process. You also typically would come up with a hypothesis when you're leveraging a quantitative research approach and not a qualitative research approach here. And there's a whole lot of statistics involved here, is it? When you're analyzing your data, typically, or your quantitative data, you usually employ statistics, descriptive statistics, inferential statistics, right? Also, there's quite a bit of issues as they relate to testing the validity of the data collected and the reliability of the data collected, and also, more importantly, to what extent you can generalize your findings, right? It's one of the reasons why appropriate sample sizes are important. If that makes sense. Anyways, and then again, I thought I decided to sneak this in here there was a question towards the end here. You know, what sort of paradigm is associated with this study or something? So we see that for quantitative approaches, the philosophical worldview that you'd be dealing with is typically a positivism or positivism, right? Which holds that cause determines effect or outcome. This is one of the reasons why in quantitative studies, you're typically interested in establishing relationships, identifying causal factors, and all those things. I don't know what this is here. You know, I'm trying to log into my other thing here, but yeah. And then we see here that this philosophical worldview associated with quantitative study holds that, you know, we can only study what we can observe and measure, right? It's like the people that hold this worldview, this philosophical worldview, who normally frown upon things like we went to speak to people and we were asking them their feelings about the LIS 2034 course. You can't measure that, right? You can't measure somebody's feelings. You can only interpret how somebody feels, right? Anyways, so and usually there's a lot of subjectivity in terms of like when you're analyzing that sort of qualitative data, right? Like interviews. And then again, this philosophical worldview holds that research should be objective and not subjective, right? And should be unbiased. So the goal typically is to test and refine theories, right? Anyways, and then we gave specific examples of instances when you'd find yourself leveraging quantitative research approaches. For instance, if you're looking at identifying factors that influence an outcome. Does gender affect the performance of students in LIS 2034? Don't know. If you're looking at trying to understand the best predictors of an outcome, is the performance in LIS 2034, or what are the key factors that influence performance in LIS 2034? If you conduct that study, maybe you realize that it's workload and things like course engagement. So people that don't have an overload and people that attend tutorials and classes regularly have a higher chance of performing better than those that don't, you know? Or when you're trying to test a theory or an intervention, you're trying to test if this new malaria drug is more effective than Coartem or something like that. Anyways, and I gave an example that you can easily refer to here because this is something that has happened. They've designed a new website for the UNZA. I don't know how many of you have seen this here. You can conduct a study if you wish, a study that is aimed at trying to ascertain if this new website design results in people who are accessing the website being able to find information easily than the previous old design. Now, this new design would be an intervention. So you're comparing this intervention with the baseline, which is the old design or something like that. I'm just trying to put it out there that an intervention doesn't necessarily have to be medicine, right? A new drug, that is. An intervention can be a piece of software. An intervention can be a device, a hardware device. It's like we will experiment with having our students in LIS 2034 regularly or routinely use tablets. So we're going to purchase tablets and give them the tablets. And then we'll conduct an experiment that is aimed at trying to see if your performance of students enrolled in LIS 2034 will perform better when they're using the tablets. You understand? The tablet is an intervention. Anyways. So next up is the so-called qualitative research approach. Now, the focus here is on understanding the meaning, for instance, right? The meaning of something, or exploring a problem in depth. I want to understand here, why is it that students in LIS 2034 do not attend the Tuesday morning class? I want to explore that problem. It's a problem. I expect them to attend class. Why do they not attend class? I mean, you can't possibly tell me. I guess you could conduct a quantitative, you can design a quantitative study aimed at understanding that problem, but you are better off conducting a qualitative study so that you explore in depth why students don't show up for class on Tuesdays at 7. Okay. Also, you'd find yourself using this study, or the focus of such an approach would be to describe experiences from the perspective of the people you are studying, the participants. Anyway, and then in terms of the data type that you use, this is generally non-numeric data, right? Unstructured data. So things like text, so field notes, observations, images, documents. So if you find yourself doing like document analysis or something, that's classic qualitative study you're conducting. If your study involves some kind of observation, going out there and trying to see how people do things. I have a student of mine, or I have students of mine who are working towards making attendance more effective, in-class attendance more effective. And so one of the students, I don't know if she's been in the LIS 2034 class, but she's been in 3020 class. One of some of the students who attend class will sit at the back somewhere, right? And just see what happens. So when I walk in class, how do I take attendance? And they'll notice that Lighton, first of all, pulls out a register from his bag, and then he passes it around, and students start signing. They're observing. That's classic qualitative. That's a classic qualitative research approach. Those sort of data that you're dealing with. Interview transcripts, right? So you conduct an interview. Obviously, you'd record that interview. After you record the interview, you transcribe it to text, right? The data that you'd be analyzing is non-numeric data. It's textual content, right? So again, in terms of the key concepts, what we see here is a situation where you are focusing a bit more on things like meaning, right? Context is important. The participant's perspective is what you value the most, right? Because you're interested in describing their experiences. In most instances, you will organize the data once analyzed in themes, for instance. It's like if I came and interviewed you to try and find out why you don't attend classes, a representative sample from amongst you. To present the results of the interviews conducted, what I would probably do is I would, upon analyzing the transcribed data, I would likely find myself organizing the results in themes, right? So it will be things like proximity. I'm anticipating here, proximity from campus. So I'll be in here, I'll be talking in this particular theme, I'll be talking about, a lot of students complained that they're unable to attend 7 hours class because they stay further away from campus. Then you even have verbatim text. For instance, participant 1 mentioned that they stay in 16 miles or something like that. It would be things like transportation. I guess would be tied to proximity here. So in this particular theme, I'll be talking about, because you stay far here, finding transport early around 06 is difficult in some areas. And then you even have verbatim text. Participant number 3 mentioned that they come from, I don't know if it's Matero or something, and buses from Matero will normally start moving. A lot of them will normally start moving somewhere around 7 or something. And so by the time they get into campus, it's already too late, So themes, right? And then there's a lot of interpretation of data, right? Because these are subjective responses that you normally get, and then there's, again, a bit of research and reflexivity. We'll talk a bit more here when we discuss thematic analysis, theory of reflexivity. It turns out that you can analyze, or interpret interview data in so many different ways, but reflexivity is one of those most widely used approaches. And then in terms of the philosophical underpinning here, or the paradigm, we see that it's tied to interpretivism, right? Or constructivism, which holds that individuals seek to understand the world they live in. It's not enough for us to just look at absolute numbers. Like right now, the proponents of this worldview will argue that it's not enough for us to come here and just say 76 people out of, I don't know if it's 130 or so students attended class. You'll be able to understand things a lot easier. Well, 76 out of 76, 50% were female, and 60% were female and 40% were male, or something like that. That's not enough, right? What you'd much rather do is you would want to understand things a lot better, in depth, right? Rather than looking at absolute numbers. The argument here is you're better off trying to find out why this is the case. Yeah. And again, we see here that the meaning that you extract, right, using this worldview here, is subjective, is it? You typically would construct that meaning by interacting with people. You know, if I'm to interpret the effectiveness of a drug when I collect the data using a quantitative approach, it'll be a lot easier, right? I'll be able to experimentally determine that adults should take 2 tablets of paracetamol, whereas kids should take 1 tablet for them to feel much, much better when they're in pain, right? However, when you take a qualitative approach, tables 10, you're more interested in extracting your meaning. You do your interpretation by interacting with the participants. So we see here that the goal of the research is to interpret meaning that the participants have about the world around them. You understand? The key thing here really is you want to pay particular attention to things like what sort of data types do you normally deal with, right? What is the focus? Yeah. And more importantly, in what instances would you want to use this research approach? We would want to use this research approach when you want to explore a phenomenon, right? Something you don't know about. I have an example here. We know very little about the information overload, right? Insofar as first years are concerned. Like we don't know, nobody has conducted that study. For us to explore that, right, we would need to conduct a qualitative study. You'd also find yourself leveraging a qualitative approach when you need to understand a complex phenomenon in detail. I don't know if this example makes a bit more sense here, but why do students engage in reckless behavior or something? I don't know if that's complex. It's not complex. I think we know, right? There's issues to do with the prefrontal cortex. The people that are proponents of the quantitative studies have told us, right? Your brain is still developing. You know what they say about the prefrontal cortex, is it? It's only fully developed somewhere in your mid-20s, right? Which is why usually people in your age range will engage in very reckless behavior, going out there, doing drugs and partying when you should be studying and all those things. But anyways, so when you're seeking to understand a complex phenomenon, or if, let's say, you wanted to empower individuals, right? We've noticed that there are certain marginalized or disadvantaged communities in the rural areas. How can we empower them, right? You'd conduct a qualitative study or something. Probably, in fact, a specific type of quantitative study here would probably leverage. I don't know if you remember our discussion of ethnography, for instance, right? Is what you'd be using here. Anyway, also we see that this approach may be the right choice if you have an existing theory which does not fit the group that you're studying, right? All those things. Right, so quantitative, and I know if you notice, right, the easiest way of getting around this, well, not the getting around this, if the question comes up, somebody asks you, there's this problem that needs to be explored. It's like, what method are you going to use between a quantitative and a qualitative study? You'd have to think about the research design, right? Are you exploring? Are you explaining? Are you describing? Remember those types of research? I don't know if you remember that. Anyways, so the third research approach is what we introduced as a mixed methods research approach. And if you remember, what we said in this research approach is you're combining the best of both worlds. So you're combining the quantitative and qualitative research approaches in order to gain a comprehensive understanding of a problem. Incidentally, a lot of studies that we do in my research group and with the students that I work on, we, in most instances, we actually find ourselves incorporating so we heavily rely on quantitative studies because we'll do things like build software, and so we need to test software and gather requirements and stuff. But in some instances, we incorporate aspects of qualitative research designs, right? Where we conduct interviews or we go and conduct observations, for instance. So we typically conduct so-called mixed methods approaches. Okay. Now, because we are combining the two, obviously data type here is a combination of the two, is it? It's both numeric and non-numeric data that you're collecting. In other words, you'd be collecting data through questionnaires or through true experiments or quasi-experiments, and also collecting data by leveraging interviews. Or you conduct a content analysis or a document analysis, for instance. Yeah. And typically, you find yourself conducting quite a bit of integration here. And the idea, behind this integration, integrating data from both quantitative and qualitative approaches, the idea here is that a combination of both types of data will provide you with comprehensive insights, right? Which is impossible to get if you just use quantitative approach in isolation or a qualitative approach in isolation. Often aligned with what we introduce as pragmatism, right? Where we're saying that the focus when it comes to pragmatism is on the research problem and what works best to solve it. So the researchers, people like you, would have the freedom to choose the best methods for the job. And the thinking here, right? Because you're using the best of both worlds, you're saying the argument there is that for you to get, for you to extract knowledge or truth, because research is about finding out what is true, is it? You're after the truth. It's what works at the time. It can be both quantitative, or it can be qualitative, or it can be quantitative. You're being pragmatic like that. Now, I want to draw attention to some interesting stuff that you will find in one of the prescribed books by Cresswell and Cresswell. I'm not sure where exactly in the most recent edition you'll find this information, but certainly in the 2018 edition here, there's mention of the fact that there are three main types of mixed methods designs. In other words, we can combine data collected using quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches in three main ways, right? And it turns out that out of the three here, the design that you choose depends on what you are working towards, the goal. It also depends on the timing, right? And also the importance or emphasis that you are placing on each type of data. So for instance, are you placing more importance on quantitative data collected using quantitative approach, or are you placing more emphasis on the data that is collected using the qualitative approach? So these three things, the goal, the timing, and the emphasis, will help you determine which specific mixed methods design you're going to employ. So three main mixed methods approaches here are so-called convergent mixed methods design, explanatory sequential mixed methods design, and exploratory sequential mixed methods design. So three main types here. Usually students get it wrong here for the last two, right? They seem similar here. In the first instance, we are dealing with explaining something, right? So explanatory. The last one is exploratory. So we are exploring. And you notice here that based on what the focus is, you tend to combine, quantitative data and qualitative data in different ways here. So the idea or the purpose of this, the first design, which is the convergent mixed methods design, convergent mixed methods design, explanatory sequential mixed methods design, and exploratory sequential mixed methods design. The purpose of the convergent mixed methods design is to obtain a more complete understanding of whatever topic, right, or domain you are studying by collecting both quantitative and qualitative data at the same time. And here's the thing, right? In a convergent, and I think the name gives it away, right? You're converging. You're going to converge at some point. You're collecting quantitative and qualitative data at the same time. And then what you do once you collect, we are done with the data collection, is you're going to compare, right, the quantitative data and the qualitative data, or you're going to merge the two and interpret those findings. And the thinking here is that what you're doing is you're trying to see if you're trying to compare if the quantitative data and the qualitative data are going to tell you the same thing, ideally. Simply put, if you have a problem, let's say you're trying to understand whether Lighton is effective in teaching 2034. Say, because we want to get the students' perspectives, right? The in-depth perspectives, and also because we want to be able to generalize the findings, what we are going to do is we're going to distribute a questionnaire, and then at the same time, we will identify a representative sample from your group and interview them. So we've distributed a questionnaire, and we're collecting these responses, and then at the same time, we are interviewing some of you, right? And then we analyze the data. What we would have done here is we would have come up with what's called a convergent mixed methods design. The key here is you're collecting data, the quantitative and qualitative data at the same time. In all these three instances, right? Convergent, explanatory, exploratory, sequential, explanatory, sequential. You are collecting both quantitative and qualitative data, but the key is how are you collecting this data? In the convergent mixed methods design, you're collecting the data at the same time, right? And the procedure is simple here, right? Collect quantitative data and qualitative data, quan and qual, concurrently at the same time. Analyze both data sets separately. Merge the two data sets, right? To check if there's convergence, if there's divergence, or if there are any contradictions. Simple stuff, right? Now the question is, when do we use this? Well, typically you use this method when you want to compare your quantitative results with the qualitative results. If one of the goals is you just want to compare if the results that you're going to get when you interview the LIS 2034 students and when you get the questionnaire responses, if you want to compare the two results, then what you'd have to come up with is a convergent mixed methods design. Yep. And the notation here, if you're looking for notation, is it's quan plus qual, right? You're combining. You're combining the quantitative data and the qualitative data. I thought I would include a visual representation of this, right? So what we are saying in your convergent mixed methods approach is you are merging, right, or comparing quantitative data and qualitative data to come up with an interpretation. Yep. And then the second mixed methods design is explanatory sequential mixed method design. And the purpose is to use qualitative findings to help explain, interpret, or elaborate initial quantitative results. Now, here's the thing here. What you're doing here is you first of all collect data using a quantitative approach. You collect the numbers first, and then the thinking there is to help explain the numbers you've collected, the numeric data. You then conduct a follow-up qualitative study. So in other words, what you're doing is you're starting off with a quantitative, you collect data, quantitative data first, and then you collect the qualitative data. Yeah, so the procedure is simple. You collect and analyze quantitative data, and then you use the quantitative results, right, to plan what sort of qualitative data you're going to conduct here. And then you collect your qualitative data, and then you interpret how this qualitative data helps explain quantitative data. So if we go back to our LIS 2034 example, where we're trying to find out your perceptions on Lighton's effectiveness in teaching 2034. What I would do if I decided to come up with an explanatory sequential mixed methods design is I would distribute a questionnaire, and then I analyze the data in the questionnaire. What I'll find in the questionnaire perhaps is I'll find interesting things, maybe from specific minors, or maybe interesting things as they relate to the gender. Because of those interesting things, I then use the results to inform a follow-up qualitative study. So this qualitative study could maybe be interviews, right? So I'll plan, I'll construct my interview guide, semi-structured interview guide, using the outcome of the quantitative study. You understand? Because you want the qualitative study to help explain those numbers that you've collected. In fact, it's the reason why, in most instances, I don't know if you've seen this, you're responding to a questionnaire, and they'll ask you, right? Would you like, would you be okay if we contacted you to make a follow-up on this particular study? When you tick yes, they'll say specify your email address. And so what they're going to do afterwards is, after they analyze the data, they'll cherry pick. If they find that you are a unique case, and they'll discover that you're a unique case by looking at your responses, right? They will mark you and invite you to participate in some interview or something. What they're doing there is they're leveraging an explanatory sequential mixed methods approach. And this makes sense, right? You are trying to explain the numbers. So it's explanatory sequential mixed methods design. Now, when to use this? Quite simple, really. You use this when you have unexpected quantitative results. This is me distributing a questionnaire to you, and I'm trying to find out, am I effective at teaching LIS 2034? Because I'm typical on my high horse here. I'm like, I expect these to be positive results, and in fact, there's going to be balanced views from both genders and all minors or something. But I collect the results and I analyze them, and I realize, it appears if I compare the responses from the females and the males seem to suggest that I'm effective, but the vast majority of the females suggest that I'm not effective, right? So I would want to understand those numbers. What do? I design an interview guide, right? Or I plan to conduct interviews, probably with females or something, so that I help explain those results, those unexpected results. It's surprising, right? Anyway, so and then the notation here is simple. Quan followed by qual, right? So we're starting off with a quantitative study, and then you have a follow-on qualitative study. But there's a link here, is it? I mean, there's something special here. You can only conduct a qualitative study once you analyze the quantitative data that you collected using quantitative approach. You are explaining, right? So it's explanatory sequential mixed methods design. But sequential here is you're following something, is it? You start with something followed by the other thing. You start with quantitative approach followed by the qualitative approach. Anyways, a visual representation. What we see here is that the quantitative data collection and eventual analysis is going to inform what you do as part of this qualitative data collection and analysis phase. And then ultimately, the combination of the two here is going to help with your interpretation. So your quantitative results ideally are explained by your qualitative results. Pretty straightforward. And then finally, we have the exploratory sequential mixed methods design. And the phrase that gives away this is you are exploring, is it? exploratory. Remember the different study designs we discussed in, I think, the very first class we had? Types of research, right? Exploratory, explanatory, right? Descriptive, and all those things. Well, it turns out that the purpose when you decide to leverage an exploratory sequential mixed methods design is to first explore a phenomenon or a topic with qualitative data, and then use the qualitative findings here to build the quantitative phase. So in other words, you start off with stories, for instance, to develop a new instrument or theory or intervention, and then you test it. Exploratory. The procedure is simple. You collect and analyze qualitative data. So you're going to conduct, first of all, observations, or you conduct interviews, or you do document analysis, right? Those are all qualitative qualitative data collection techniques, right? And then you use the findings from these qualitative studies that you'd have conducted to build the quantitative phase, right? In other words, if you're thinking about it in terms of instruments, right? You construct, you wouldn't know beforehand. If you use the same example where you're trying to understand if Lighton is effective at teaching, you're saying, we don't know what sort of questions we're going to include in the questionnaire. We just don't know. We're trying to find out whether Lighton is effective, but we don't know what to include. Like, we don't know the factors, so what do we do? Okay, we're going to first of all interview a subset of you, and then based on the outcomes from the interviews, we'll discover, say, there are certain important factors that we wouldn't have identified. Using that information, we will build a more comprehensive questionnaire, which we'll then distribute, right? So you collect the qualitative data, use the qualitative data to build the quantitative phase, and then you collect and analyze the quantitative data to test the feature of something built, and then you interpret the findings. Now, I'm just using the Lighton's effectiveness as an example here, right? We normally use this when you're building software. You know, we would say, we don't know how to build this piece of software. In fact, I worked with students last year and the year before. We don't know how to build the radiology information system. So what are we going to do? You guys are going to camp at UTH for a month. You will be there working with people who process NEMA, associated, clients, those that are cash clients or something. And then we'll use that information to build a piece of software, right? And then we collect quantitative data about the evaluation of the software or something like that. But anyway, the key thing here, if you pay particular attention, is the notation is you, first of all, start with the qualitative approach followed by the quantitative approach. And you tend to use this mixed methods design when existing instruments or theories are not adequate for your population, or when you want to develop and test something new. You're trying to build a piece of software, a new piece of software. You're better off using exploratory sequential mixed methods design. Very sad that most of our students, right, will just play around with some of these things. We use the mixed methods approach because we combined quantitative data and qualitative data. It's like, what specific mixed methods design did you use, right? Which one? Anyways, and then a visual representation of this, right? What we see here is you start off with the qualitative data collection and analysis, and then you're building upon the qualitative data and analysis, right, to design your quantitative study here, right, or to come up with a plan on how you're going to collect the quantitative data and subsequently analyze it. And finally, interpretation here will involve testing a feature developed from qualitative analysis. So it's pretty straightforward here. Hopefully you'll be able to figure out how these things come into play, right? What you will notice when you get into reading this, those of you that have read this, or those of you that are going to plan to read the prescribed text on this particular topic, you notice that in as much as we've focused on these three types of mixed methods designs, But it turns out that there are other mixed methods designs that you can leverage, because what you're doing is you're just combining different ways of collecting data, right? The key here is, in as much as there are others, the key here is to appreciate that you're combining quantitative and qualitative data, in other words. So for instance, you can leverage what's included in Creswell and Creswell's book as mixed methods experimental design, right? So you are adding a qualitative component to a traditional experiment to understand participant experience. It's like, I don't know, you guys, right? I don't know, well, I want to find out my effectiveness. What do I do? What do we do? We construct a quasi, right? A quasi experiment. It's not a true experiment, it's a quasi force. So we construct a quasi experiment, and we construct it in such a way that, well, we're going to have Lighton teach term 1, and then we're going to have Piela teach term 2. Now, in as much as we can design this is still quasi experience. Is it effectiveness, right? LP is effectiveness. In as much as we can use a true experiment here, right? A pure or a quasi experiment to try and determine whether Lighton is effective, just by looking at your performance in first term, and then we'll look at your performance in second term when Piela teaches. But we may be interested in finding out more details, right? Over and beyond these quasi experiments, what we can do is we can say we are also going to interview. We are going to interview at the end of term 2. So we collect data at term 1, or maybe we collect data in term 1, we interview you. We collect data in term 2, we also interview you. That's a classic example of a mixed method experimental design, right? This is what we're saying. You'll be interviewing participants after an experiment to understand why the intervention worked. You know, yeah, but there's still 3 minutes, Miss Loveness. And then you can also have like a mixed methods case study design, you know, where you're using both quantitative and qualitative data to provide rich in-depth understanding of one or more case studies or cases, right? Now, the key thing here is that these complex designs will use these 2 core designs as building blocks: quantitative designs and qualitative designs, right? I want to leave it at that, just to mention that when we meet next, we're going to start looking at you know, sampling and all those things. I believe, but before we can do that, we will. No, I think it's measurement instruments actually, or maybe we'll flip this. But I'll see you over the weekend. Somebody was telling me here just now, reminding us that they have another class or something. Unless there are any questions. Okay, no questions. Thank you very much, everybody. I'll see you when you see me. We have class on Saturday. Bye for now. Hey, good luck with your class, which you have. Miss Zimba was reminding us here.